So we can think about these two kinds of arguments, and I used my little, I don't know, what do we call it, Birkenstock liberal versus dock worker guy to illustrate these two kinds of arguments. Right? So real men use deductive arguments where the truth of the premises necessitates the truth of the conclusion. Right? So all deductive arguments have this inferential claim. They claim, look, if my premises are true, then my conclusion is necessarily true. It has to be true. There's no way it cannot be true. That's the inferential claim. That's what it is to be a deductive argument. Right? On the other hand, right, our inductive reasoner says, well, that kind of posing just masks the fear of inductive arguments, where the truth of the premises makes the conclusion probable. It doesn't guarantee that it's true. It doesn't necessitate it's true, but it does make it more likely to be true than chance or than what we thought before we had the argument. On the other hand, right, deducers are going to break their arguments down. They're going to say, look, arguments that satisfy that inferential claim, right, such that if their premises are true, then their conclusion has to be true. Those arguments are going to be said to be valid. So a valid argument has a structure, a relationship between the premises and the conclusion that satisfies its inferential claim. That is, if the premises are true, not they are true, but if they're true, then the conclusion has to be true. So whenever the premises are true, the conclusion will also be true. That's a valid argument. However, if your deductive argument fails, if there's even one way, no matter how obscure or distant from the actual state of affairs, if there's just one possibility where the premises are true and the conclusion isn't guaranteed to be true, then that argument is said to be invalid. So good deductive arguments are valid arguments. They guarantee the conclusion is true if the premises are true. Any argument that fails to make that guarantee, there's a way for the premises to be true without guaranteeing that the conclusion is true, that's a bad deductive argument. It's called an invalid deductive argument. What about induction? Well, induction also has two evaluative terms. But because probability ranges from 0 to 1 on a spectrum, right, these aren't binary the way valid and invalid are. You're valid or you're invalid. You're not both. You're not kind of. You're not sort of valid. You are either completely valid or completely invalid. With inductive arguments, however, there is a range between strong and weak. So a weak argument is an argument that doesn't really make the conclusion more likely to be true if the premises are true. Right? So that kind of argument doesn't give you any sort of epistemic edge. It doesn't help you to know something more about the world than you did before you got the argument. Those arguments are thought to be weak arguments. Strong arguments, on the other hand, are arguments that they satisfy their inferential claim. That is, if the premises are true, then the conclusion really is more likely to be true, more likely than chance, more likely than was previously thought or estimated prior to that argument. Those are the strong arguments. Now, strength, right, can go from that cutoff point, say chance, to completely, absolutely true. Right? So they can vary in their strength, and likewise they can vary in their weakness. But there is this sort of cutoff point, and then it's not always exactly clear, and sometimes we just adopt conventions about what counts as a strong versus a weak argument. Right? But the idea really is you've got to do better than you would do just by guessing or by chance itself. So let's take an example, say, from baseball. Right? So if you've got a batting average of, say, 300, right, that means basically 3 times out of every 10 times you go to bat, you actually have a hit. Now, that doesn't really actually seem to be very good. Right? But in fact, it's actually quite good. Right? So if you've got a batting average of 300, chances are, if you've got other skills, you're going to end up making millions of dollars in baseball. Right? That's a really good batting average because a professionally pitched baseball, right, it can break in all sorts of weird ways, and it can come at you so fast that your eye can't actually track it. So most people probably would bat, somewhere close to 0 on professional pitches. Right? So to be a good batter isn't to be 100% good. It isn't even to be 50% good. Right? It's to be significantly better than the average person at that. And that's how these arguments are. Right? They don't have to be guaranteeing the truth of the conclusion if the premises are true. They just have to be guaranteeing that the conclusion is more likely than it would be otherwise. So deductive arguments are making a trade-off. That is, they're trading power, how much information you can get from your argument, how far you can go beyond what's already clearly known to you. Right? They're trading a bit of that off for truth, right? That guarantee of truth. So a good deductive argument is an argument that just tells you what has to be true given what you know already. It doesn't extend your knowledge beyond what's already guaranteed or necessitated to be true. And so sometimes philosophers and logicians refer to deductive arguments as non-amplitive. Some people think that they're empty or trivial in this way, but they're not really, because oftentimes, right, what's guaranteed to be true, given what you know, isn't something that's obvious or readily available to you. And deductive arguments make it obvious and readily available and clear to you, and for that reason they are incredibly useful. But they can extend your knowledge base beyond what's already guaranteed to be true, given what you know. Inductive arguments, on the other hand, do. Inductive arguments trade a little bit of that guarantee of truth to get inferential power. Inductive arguments are what philosophers and logicians tend to call amplitive arguments. They go beyond what's guaranteed to be true. They leverage what you know to try and get you a wider scope of information. But to do that, they trade off a little bit of the guarantee of truth. That is, they take a risk. They allow for the possibility, hopefully relatively small, that your conclusion really isn't true. And they do this usually by leveraging something about the world that is generally true but not necessarily true. Right? So, for instance, in statistical inferences, statistics leverages the relationship between a reasonably large, randomly selected, unbiased sample and the population from which it's drawn. We know that there are relatively stable relationships. Those relationships aren't always true, right? But they tend to be true. And so statistics leverages that relationship between a sample and a population to get you information about the population without having to sample the entire population. So it trades off a little bit of truth to get that extra powerful inference. So for deduction, if your premises are true, you've got good content, right? And your argument has a good inferential claim. Its structure is good, it's valid, right? Then the argument is said to be sound. It has both components of a good argument. Right? It's got good content, good premises, and it's got good structure. It's valid. That's a sound argument. Any argument that has a false premise, or multiple false premises, or that isn't valid, doesn't have good logical structure, is said to be unsound. And again, these are binary distinctions. Right? So to be valid, you have to have that structural relationship. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. To be sound, you have to have that and true premises. Right? If you're missing either component, then you're unsound. When we turn to induction, right, then arguments that are strong, that is, they have good inductive structure and true premises, are said to be cogent arguments. That is, they do make your conclusion highly probable because your premises are true and the relationship between the premises and that conclusion really does make the conclusion highly likely. Right? So if you have both components, structure and content, then you're said to be cogent. If you don't, then you're said to be uncogent. Right? If your premises, even one, is false, or your argument isn't a good inductive inferential claim argument, then you're said to be uncogent. So let's go ahead and review those evaluative terms and the nature of arguments that those terms describe. So arguments are structured collections of statements. Statements are expressions of a language that have truth values. That is, they can be true or they can be false. Because every statement has a truth value, but we don't always know what the truth value is, We also know that statements have probabilities, estimates of how likely a statement is to be true or false, given what we know at the time. Deductive arguments are structured collections of statements. If they are structured collections of statements that have this relationship, the structure, the inferential claim is such that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, then they're said to be valid. They don't have to have two premises to be valid, but they have to have that relationship that if the premises were true, that really would guarantee the conclusion is true. Now, if an argument is valid and it has good content, that is, it has true premises, right, then it's said to be sound. It's got both components of a good argument. Right? It's got good structure, it's got good content, so the content through the structure gets you to a necessarily true conclusion. Right? If you've got a valid argument, however, and you don't have true premises, then that argument structure doesn't really help you because you've got bad content. And so valid arguments with false premises are said to be unsound. Right? Now, if you've got a bad logical structure, if the inferential claim associated with deductive arguments, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. If that claim really doesn't hold up, there are ways for the premises to be true without the conclusion being true, then your argument has bad logical form and it's said to be invalid. If an argument is invalid, it's always going to be unsound. It doesn't matter whether the premises are true or not. What about inductive arguments? Well, inductive arguments also have these two components to them, the underlying logical structure and the content component. So a good inductive argument, an argument that makes that inductive inferential claim, if the premises are true, the conclusion is highly probable, and that claim really does hold up, right, then that argument is said to be strong. Now, if I've got a strong argument and I've got good content, i.e. true premises, then my argument is said to be cogent. It's got both components. It's got good logical form and it's got good content, good premises. However, if I've got good logical form, I've got a strong argument, but I don't have true premises, the argument can't do its work. The structure doesn't help me because it doesn't have true premises, and so the argument is said to be uncogent. Likewise, if an argument is weak, that is, if its inferential claim really doesn't hold up, the truth of the premises wouldn't really make the conclusion highly probable, right? Then you can't use true premises to get to a highly probable conclusion with this argument. It's a bad argument, and all bad arguments in induction are uncogent arguments. Okay? So hopefully this gives you a sort of broader introduction to arguments than in the Rachel's chapter itself. In our next lecture, we'll actually talk about the Rachel's chapter specifically and go through it in greater detail.